Hi, and welcome back to C. Myers Live. My name is Brian McHenry, and I'm a principal at C. Myers Corporation.
And I'm Charlene Leland. I'm a vice president with C. Myers.
Today, what we want to talk about is I'll say not necessarily a new topic, but an ongoing conversation that we're having with CEOs around the need to elevate their team's ALM knowledge. Because certainly as rates rose in 2023 and they've stayed elevated into 2024, there's still what the CEOs are finding is there's still just some gaps and connections that they're not necessarily seeing in their team's thinking and decision making. And so they're feeling like this is an area that they need to continue to address.
Yeah, and I think that it's probably one of the most common things we hear when people come for leadership development. If they didn't come up through the financial side of their business, um, they feel a gap in that area. It's like, oh, I really need to get better at the financials. I understand how the rest of the business works. So this area, for whatever reason, seems to take a little extra intention in order to bring people along. And I think for some people, there's a certain amount of maybe just, I don't want to call it fear exactly, but oh, I don't know about that. And it seems so big and complicated if you don't have the basic understanding. So one of the things, in order for people to understand ALM and the effects that that's having, is they need a financial foundation just in the basics first before they can move forward. So we do a lot of education in the financial area, both with people who are very advanced and those who are just starting out. And one of the things that we've found is that keeping it simple to start is just such a key, because it can be overwhelming. And if you start to cut it down to, okay, just pay attention to these things right here to start, it can make it a lot simpler.
Yeah, so a couple of examples of that would be what I would describe as even just like vocabulary. Like, do they know the vocabulary and I'll say the definitions of what's being used on the terms, especially on ratios, even understanding what's being calculated, what are the components of that ratio. Some, like loan to asset ratio, have it in the name, but not all do. Operating expense ratio does not necessarily articulate both sides of that ratio. So just understanding that piece, this is part of what you're saying, Charlene, is like
Yeah.
the financial foundation, knowing what that is, how to describe it, how it's calculated. Also, the other thing is there are just different ways to talk about the same thing. There's some different terms that have similar meanings. So being able to help people understand that there can be multiple terms for the same thing.
Or the same term for different things. If you think about cost of funds, it's often talked about as a percentage of the deposits, or it can be as a percentage of assets. And so
Yeah.
there's some tricky little things in there. But as far as keeping it simple to start, we use a tool called the 5 strategy levers. We break down what goes into ROA, into the yield on assets, the cost of funds, the operating expense, provision or expected credit loss, and non-interest income. If you just look at it from that level to start, people can start to get their head around the effective profitability and as a whole. There's lots of little pieces to it, but to start with that can be really helpful. Take a look at another organization using FDIC or NCUA data that's publicly available, and have them take that high level view and dig into one of those. They'll usually choose a competitor because they think that that's more interesting and fun. And the thing that can really help them extend their understanding is those ratios that they're looking at can help them understand what the other business models are, how their business model is different, or even bring up questions like, I don't understand why this ratio is different than ours or very different from ours, because I don't see anything in their business model that makes a difference. So it helps them to start actually using that knowledge and asking those information so they can internalize the concepts.
Yeah, and I really want to punctuate what you just said around understanding the business model and the financial structure and seeing how it comes through in financials and how it's put into action. That's really important. And as they gain that knowledge or do that thinking, it makes then leaders much more effective when it comes to their own business models and financial structures. And then this is the foundation that they can start to build on when it comes to asset liability management. Because now that they understand, okay, well, here's what this means first, and then here's how it connects together in our financial structure. Now you can start adding in things like what happens if, when rates change? How does this impact our liquidity? The interest rate risk pieces of it. So that's where then it starts to make more sense, especially even going back to those five levers that you mentioned, Charlene. There are things that, like operating expenses, non-interest income, rates changing don't impact that very much. That's an important concept to understand. They certainly matter in your ALM results, but they don't change with rate changes. But your yield on loans, your cost of funds, those do. And so if they understand what those things are and how they work, it starts to make a lot more sense and it's easier for them to start incorporating into their thinking and their decision making. Okay, if we want to do X, some sort of promotion as an example, here are the potential ramifications as rates change. Here are the potential ramifications from a liquidity perspective. Again, because they've got that foundational knowledge.
Yeah, so a couple of tools for you if you want to start doing this with some of your folks. On our website, we have some calculators that are pretty easy to use and intuitive. You just go to Education Tools and Events and then click on Interactive Tools. Another thing that's really helpful and another tactic for helping people is to have them teach a concept. Either have them go look it up. If they don't, if they need to understand, even a ratio, have them go look it up, understand what it means, and then teach it or explain it to other people. What we do in some of our courses is we have some short, like 5-minute videos called napkin math that explain some different concepts. We'll have people watch those and then come back and give a presentation. So there's nothing that teaches you something at a higher depth than having to teach it to somebody else. So that's a great tactic to use.
Yeah, I agree. And this is, for some, they might be thinking, well, at a certain level, especially as you start to get into that executive level, this sort of knowledge and ability should be there and be pretty strong across the board. And some of the things we're describing are the work, the things that we do with executives to help them elevate in this way. They certainly have a good understanding of their areas and the competencies and the functional areas that they work in. That makes sense. They're very, very competent there. It's then taking that and applying it from the broader financial and ALM perspective, where sometimes there's even some gaps there. And give you an example of this, a lot when rates were changing initially in 23, there were a number of chief lending officers or the heads of lending still really trying to think through from a pricing perspective of keeping it low because the volume was really good and walking through even the five levers to help show the profitability and then how that might change. There were some ahas at that point that the volume, while that can be good, they could be actually creating a much bigger challenge in the future versus the benefits of the volume they're getting today. So again, want to hit that point of it's really important from a even an executive level perspective, also because that's how they're going to influence and develop their people. They need to bring their leaders along when it comes to this type of knowledge so that the whole organization continues to elevate in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of those questions actually come from frontline people who are dealing directly with the customers, and they wonder, they're not expected to understand ALM, but they need a good answer when they ask, why can't we keep our loan prices lower? Why are we charging so much on loans? Or why aren't we giving back more on deposit rates?
Yeah. Yeah. And this is, CFOs have an opportunity here too. So you think about what are some of the other ways? Yes, getting the financial knowledge, that foundational knowledge is really helpful. Look at call reports. All of that's really helpful. CFOs too, what we've seen in working with a lot of CFOs is that their mindset needs to continue to shift as well. That yes, while they're the strategic financial leader, they've got to also incorporate as part of that role some education and constant and ongoing education because not everyone thinks about this or sees the numbers every day. So something that's very natural to them and common to them is not natural and common to others on their team. So making sure they're bringing that into their meetings and to the conversations. And I want to add here too, really thinking about the way in which they communicate had a number of times where we've got a mix of financial, CFOs and non-financial leaders at the executive level, and CFOs will start talking, and it's like they're talking to another CFO or to their finance team. And some of the non-financial leaders, you can see it that they're not necessarily understanding the point that CFO is trying to make. And so it's getting in the way of the organization's ability to make decisions that are connected. And many of those non-financial leaders will then say, I'm not with you. I don't understand. And so really from a CFO standpoint, rethinking how do I speak to that broader audience? There is a time to speak like a CFO to another CFO, and there's a time to really think about how do I educate and be able to communicate things to non-financial people so that we all understand and make more informed decisions.
I think the real danger there is if you have people who are not fully understanding and they aren't asking the questions, it reinforces their what I referred to earlier as their fear of just like, oh, I'm just not good at this. I don't understand this stuff, and then they stop trying. And then the other thing too about the communication is if you can't communicate well with your leadership team, how can you communicate well with a board who in depending on the individuals, may have less of a financial, big picture financial understanding than the leadership team. So it's a really important skill set to have is that being able to gauge the communication for the audience.
Yeah, this is so agree. And so it's a dual responsibility to build on what you're saying, Charlene. Then part of what CFOs and CEOs can do in conversations that are more ALM and financial related is not let people leave without asking a question. Part of the agreement for the meeting is everyone goes around and you ask a question. And that creates the environment where one, you get over the apprehension of not knowing. Two, you get to know what's on people's minds and what's clear and what's not clear. And often what we've seen when teams have done that is there are questions that come up where the CFO is like, that's a unique perspective. I hadn't considered that. So it makes the thinking better, but it's got to be in some ways almost forced. And that's a strong word, but it's like encouraged to this is just what needs to happen. You have to ask a question, and that'll help also then that'll help elevate the team's knowledge.
Yeah, I like that one a lot. Like you say, learning on both sides there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it comes through, I'll say, here's another example mentioned on the loan pricing when rates started going up. Right now, lots of conversations around growth, asset growth, deposit growth, membership growth. And this is where it's an opportunity for some education from an ALM perspective, and also how does the organization want to move forward? Well, here, think of deposits and members. We need to go out and acquire deposits and members. So there will be suggestions and recommendations really based on price. And that can make sense, but making sure that people are connecting, well, what are the potential impacts of that from an ALM perspective? Yes, we want to balance serving our members. Yes, we know that some growth is necessary. We have to consider liquidity. This is where having people ask questions, but also asking questions that help people think can be really helpful. So if we want to go out and run a promotion to bring in deposits, to bring in members, okay, here's the benefits of that today. Let's think about if rates go down 100 or 200 basis points. And you don't have to have a model to do that. You can just think out loud on that. Go back to the five levers that you mentioned. You could even use a simple tool like that. What happens if rates go up? And that can be really helpful to then, again, from an education standpoint, continue to connect back that piece of the conversations and the decision making. Yeah, so a number of ways, that CEOs and organizations can go about elevating their team on ALM. We hit really thinking from a foundational perspective, making sure the depth of knowledge is there, the understanding of the business model, the financial structure, and then that leads into the opportunity to really think from an ALM perspective, thinking about ways you can provide support for education, ongoing education. CFOs remembering that not everybody's looking at this every day, so thinking about their communication and even just some research and homework that people can do on their own to continue their own practice and their own development from an ALM perspective can be really, really beneficial and help, as we mentioned at the beginning, help CEOs see the elevation that they think their organization needs at that level for ALM. So we appreciate your time today. As always, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Otherwise, we hope you have a great day.